In 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States declared a loneliness and isolation epidemic. And I think that most of us probably can really relate to that. In the study that kind of led to that declaration, 50% of US adults said that they've experienced loneliness or isolation. And the question becomes, why? What is happening here? I'm Dr. Dana Torpey-Newman. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and some of the things that I like to do, some of my areas of expertise include understanding the ways in which we've constructed our society that lead to psychological distress. I gave a TED Talk in February of 2022 at Duke University that actually talks a little bit about this issue, but this is my attempt to talk about this and really expand upon it. And so I always like to give examples that have to do with Disney to visualize what I'm talking about because I love Disney. So get ready. So why are we so lonely? Why are we so isolated? It's interesting because if you've been to Disney World and you go to Epcot, there's the Spaceship Earth ride. And that's the ride that looks like the big white ball or sphere. And it takes you through the evolution of human civilization. And the reason it's relevant here, because you may be asking, how is that relevant here, is that the very first scene when they start to go over the development of civilization, it's this projected on the screen, all of these humans and this woolly mammoth. And the idea is that, and I think they may even say this directly, is that humans really started to thrive and grow when they realized that as a society, they had more power than they did as individuals. And that piece of when we forge bonds and connections, we are actually better. That is still just as important to us, even though we're not fighting woolly mammoths or whatever. And by the way, I'm not sure if woolly mammoths were alive then. I don't know. But I'm not the one who's in charge of the Epcot, are you doing the right thing historically? The point is this. We were doing better when we had to forge connections to keep ourselves safe. Now that we don't have to do that as frequently, we are left feeling pretty isolated and disconnected. And so this leads to this shift in what we've decided we value as a society. In our society, we've decided that we value independence. And this comes up in all of these different ways. You'll be shocked at how subtle these things are. We increasingly pursue independence across domains. In the therapy process, we are told, even as therapists, your job is to put yourself out of business because you teach your clients coping strategies that allow them to function independently. We, as parents, really emphasize to our kids the importance of learning to function independently. And because of all of that, we feel this need to operate as these independent islands. We feel like we have to know everything about everything. I always think about this as you should never trust me to do your taxes. You should never trust me to fix your car. And you should never trust me to fix your electric or plumbing situations. Why? Because I don't have these skills. It takes people in a community to have all of these different sets of skills that everyone brings to the table to function well. But what we've done as we've increasingly emphasized the importance of independence is we've left people feeling as though they have to be experts in everything. This comes up all the time also, even in the medical field where people are well, I used Dr. Google and now I know this. And it's I don't actually think that that is a good substitute for a medical degree or any other sort of education, but I understand why you feel compelled to have to figure this out yourself because society tells us that we can't rely on each other. This is a huge and overwhelming cause for loneliness. Think about how overwhelmed you are every single day trying to be everything. Some things you can do pretty well. Other things you are not equipped to be doing. Again, I should not be fixing anyone's car. I should not be dealing with the IRS on my own. And I should not be fixing anyone's electricity or plumbing, right? We need to know our limits, but we also need to have access to people who can provide support. If you are finding this content interesting and would like to hear more about what both I talk about and my husband, Dr. Eric Newman, also a clinical psychologist, please like our channel and hit subscribe because we have a lot of things that we want to talk about on here. And we really want all of you to be a part of that and participate with us, leave us comments. ask us questions that we can make YouTube videos about. We are interested in all of those things. Why? Because I love connection and I don't want to be isolated or lonely. The second factor that I think has led to this loneliness and isolation epidemic is our inability to talk about substantive topics. What does that mean? First, in our society, what we've told people is you should never talk about emotional things because emotions are dangerous and they make people uncomfortable. Like, how often have you heard people praised for like how calm they are or how like emotionless they are? That is really sending the message that there is no space for emotions in our society. And when you're told to never say things that make people uncomfortable, you're left talking about things like the weather and like if your pet did something interesting, not if your pet is sick, because then that's going to be upsetting. But, you have to keep these topics that are so boring and superficial, and they don't lead to any of that fulfilling feeling that you have when you are having like a really solid interaction with someone. Instead, it leads to surface level connections that are really counterproductive to developing these strong bonds. And so one of the things that happens is you may actually have a lot of interpersonal interactions every day, and you may come home and feel like, why do I feel so like isolated and unseen and like no one knows me and just like blah. It's probably because the things that you're talking about don't really make you feel like anyone knows you or sees you. And that's because the things that make you you, they might be controversial, they might be emotional, they're probably deep and meaningful. But what we've told society is like, no, don't talk about those things. That keeps us really isolated. I want to talk a little bit about gender differences here. These are prototypes that I'm talking about. They do not apply to every man or woman. They are also to the exclusion of people who may not define themselves as either, or who are non-binary, or who do not fit neatly into these categories. So I don't want anyone to think that this is a comprehensive description, nor do I think it is a perfect correlate for every single person, but I just like to talk about how people are socialized because I think that that helps us understand how we're in this place. Women are socialized primarily to be likable. And so women are really, really fearful, even though they very much like those conversations that are more deep and meaningful, they're very fearful of saying something that upsets someone that then causes them to be ostracized socially. And so women are often, as soon as, this is me in social situations, because I'm not good at small talk, you can imagine. Basically, I go into social situations, I'm like, hey, want to talk about something deep and meaningful? And suddenly people are like so different. They go from being like flat and like, yes, the weather's very nice. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. And then I'm like, hey, let's talk about something deep. And they're like, okay. And then they like light up. And at the end, they're usually like, wow, that felt really different. And it's like, right, because we're not just making small talk. I don't personally care if I say something that is like emotional or intense because like that's who I am. Some people aren't going to like that, and that's okay. And women often struggle to internalize that as being acceptable. Women are so fearful of like, if I'm not perfect, if I'm perceived as unlikable, then what? And it's like, well, we have a choice. We can either have deeper, more meaningful connections that are about these things that make you unlikable to some people, or we can have superficial conversations and be constantly unfulfilled. Men, on the other hand, are socialized very differently. I always joke around. I do a lot of couples therapy. That's one of my areas of expertise. And I always joke around that men are socialized to communicate one of two things: information or like how to do something, like directions or how to do something. That's it. And they engage in what I like to call parallel play, which is like, they're kind of like sitting next to each other. Maybe they're like doing an activity together, they're watching something together. But the only person that men are told, or at least heterosexual men are told that they can communicate deeper things to, is their romantic partner. And this is really hard for both of them, right? Because your romantic partner is not going to be able to fulfill all of your emotional needs. Also, your romantic partner isn't going to understand all of your emotional needs. And it's too much for any one person to be any other one person's primary support system. And so these two factors, although they are different, you can see how they lead to the same place of kind of all of us feeling pretty isolated and disconnected. The third factor that has led to this isolation and loneliness is that our lives are too busy to prioritize our relationships. I often joke around. My best friend is a psychology professor at a university, and I joke around with her. I give one of her guest lectures every year at the beginning of the year. And I always say to her class, I love your professor. She is one of my very best friends. This is the only time of year that we make time to even see each other. And that's because our lives are so busy. Every one of us has an endless to-do list, and we're basically trying not to drown. We all have professional obligations. Some people have caretaking obligations. We have the obligations to maintain our small, nuclear family. And by the time we're done with all of that, there's not a lot of space to do things that are actually emotionally meaningful with other people. I don't know about you, but I spend most of my days checking off items on my to-do list, whether it's make the breakfast or prepare meals or do laundry or make sure that I do all of the things to maintain my practice. Those are not interpersonal interactions that are bringing me grand fulfillment. Those are things that are on my to-do list. And because of this, social interactions end up seeming like a reward rather than a priority. So again, my Disney references, because I love Disney. So in Cinderella, she is promised that she gets to go to the ball, but only if she finishes all of her chores. And that includes dressing the stepsisters and washing the windows and all these things. And she finally finishes, and she's made this dress, or birds and mice have made this dress. I don't know. And she then is look, I'm ready for the ball. And they're haha, and they tear up her dress. And it's that's because her work is never really done. And it feels like that to all of us, that we are constantly just hamsters on the wheel, getting our checklist done. And we sort of promise ourselves sometimes, if I finish these things, then I can have a social interaction. But we need them on a far more frequent basis to actually feel fulfilled and not feel disconnected and lonely. Finally, I just want to talk briefly about the modern challenges that people have that people in past generations did not, which also contribute to the loneliness epidemic. Many of us don't live where we grew up, and the consequence of that is that we're often separated from family and old friends. We have to move to pursue opportunities. I've lived everywhere. And I don't have all of the support system that I started with growing up, because they're not where I am, nor have they been in many of the places that I've lived. And I think a lot of people have that experience. One of the things I talk about all the time with my clients is how hard it is to forge new relationships as adults. So there are sort of these different domains where you get to make relationships. So one is with your kids' friends' parents, but hopefully you like them because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them. If you don't have kids or pets that you take to a pet park, or a job where you go in and people have a lot in common with you, it is really, really challenging to establish just regular relationships as an adult. And it's also hard to maintain the relationships that you already had if you're not nearby, because again, if we think of our lives are too busy to prioritize relationships, that's if the relationships are right here in your face. If they're far away and you have to really make time to engage in them, you're not going to be able to do that without a lot of effort. And we always make these choices because we emphasize being productive in our society to focus on the things that we need to do rather than on our relationships, which bring us fulfillment and satisfaction. Now, you may be wondering what to do about these things, or why am I talking about this if I don't have ways to fix these things? There is not a fix right now. What we need to do is be aware of what types of values and factors have led us here, so that collectively we can all start to do different things to address this problem. Calling it the loneliness and isolation epidemic is great, but what does that mean and why does this exist? I'm hopeful that this video helped you to understand the factors that are contributing to it, so that we can all start to make smaller changes. I don't know what those look like because we're kind of stuck with this values system, but at least we can start to push back on these values and recognize that there are things that we need to do differently if we are going to have connections and more satisfying relationships. So I look forward to seeing you all for all of our videos. Check out our website as well at newmanpsych.com. And I can't wait to talk all about all of the other things that I think about all the time to understand our mental well-being.